September 12, 1946, at 2:23 p.m. in Tupelo, Mississippi, outside the Tupelo Hardware Company on Main Street. A boy stood frozen on the cracked sidewalk, his bare feet blackened from the dust of East Tupelo's unpaved roads. His name was Elvis Aaron Presley. He was 11 years old, and in his trembling right hand he clutched exactly $4.12, every penny he had managed to scrape together over 7 months of odd jobs, collecting bottles and running errands for neighbors who themselves had almost nothing to give. His palms were slick with sweat despite the autumn chill. His heart hammered against his ribcage so violently he was certain the people passing by could hear it. His jaw was tight, locked in that particular way young boys learn when they're trying desperately not to cry in public. His eyes, those eyes that would one day make millions of women weak in the knees, were wide with a cocktail of terror and desperate hope. Inside that store behind the glass sat a rifle. A .22 caliber rifle that gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a promise of something bigger, something powerful, something that might finally make the other boys stop laughing at the poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks. Elvis had dreamed of that rifle for months, had pictured himself carrying it through the woods, finally belonging to something, finally being seen as more than the skinny son of Vernon Presley, the man who'd spent time in Parchman Farm for forging a check. But his mother, Gladys Love Presley, had other plans. She had followed him into town that day, her worn cotton dress patched in 3 places, her hair pulled back in a practical bun that couldn't hide the streaks of gray that had appeared too early from too much worry. She watched her son press his nose against the glass, watched his fingers leave smudged prints on the window as he stared at that rifle with all the longing an 11-year-old heart could contain. And then she spoke the words that would alter the course of human history. "Baby," she said softly, placing her weathered hand on his shoulder, "how about a guitar instead?" Elvis turned to look at her, confusion knitting his brow. A guitar? The other boys would laugh even harder. Guitars were for hillbillies, for the men who sat on porches and played while their crops failed and their families starved. A guitar wouldn't earn him respect. A guitar wouldn't make him powerful. But the guitar cost $3.98. And that was what they could afford. He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, the particular shame of poverty that he had known his entire short life. The shame of hand-me-down clothes, the shame of government assistance, the shame of watching his father struggle and fail, over and over again. His shoulders slumped forward as the dream of the rifle dissolved like morning fog. They walked into the store together, mother and son, and Forrest L. Bobo, the store clerk who had no idea he was about to become a footnote in the greatest American success story ever told, retrieved the guitar from its display. Elvis held it awkwardly at first, the neck too long for his small arms, the strings biting into fingers that had never formed a chord. It felt foreign. It felt wrong. It felt like a consolation prize for a life that had already given him so little. He handed over his $4.12 and received 14 cents in change. What he didn't know, what no one standing in that hardware store on that unremarkable Tuesday afternoon could possibly have known, was that those 14 cents of change would be the last time Elvis Presley would ever receive less than he deserved. Fast forward 8 years. October 2, 1954 at 7:45 p.m. in Nashville, Tennessee. Elvis Presley, now 19 years old, with pomade-slicked hair and sideburns that were just beginning to define his face, stood backstage at the Grand Ole Opry, his $3.98 guitar now replaced by a Martin acoustic that he'd bought with his earnings from Sun Records. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the neck of the instrument just to keep them still. His stomach churned with a nauseating mixture of excitement and dread. He had driven all the way from Memphis with Scotty Moore and Bill Black. 7 hours in a car that rattled and groaned with every mile. 7 hours of dreaming about this moment. The Grand Ole Opry, the cathedral of country music, the place where careers were made and legends were born. He had already released That's All Right on Sun Records. It had been played on the radio. People had called in, demanding to hear it again. For the first time in his life, Elvis had tasted what it felt like to be wanted, to be heard, to matter. But the Opry was different. The Opry was validation from the establishment. The Opry was proof that he belonged. He performed that night to a crowd that didn't quite know what to make of him. His hips moved in ways country audiences had never seen. His voice slid between registers with a raw, almost dangerous energy. He gave everything he had, every ounce of passion and hunger and desperation that had been building inside him since he first held that cheap guitar in Tupelo. And when he finished, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath, he waited. Jim Denny, the talent manager of the Grand Ole Opry, approached him backstage. Elvis's heart soared. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. But Jim Denny's face held no warmth, no enthusiasm, no recognition of what he had just witnessed. "Son," Denny said, his voice flat and dismissive, "you ain't going nowhere. You ought to go back to driving a truck." The words landed like a sledgehammer to the chest. Elvis felt his face burn crimson. His throat constricted so tightly he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The backstage area, which had seemed so magical just moments before, now felt like a coffin closing around him. "You're too different," Denny continued, apparently oblivious to the destruction he was causing. "This music you're doing, it's not country, it's not pop, it's not anything. You don't fit into any of the boxes. No radio programmer's gonna know what to do with you. No audience is gonna stick around for something they can't categorize." Scotty and Bill stood nearby, their faces masks of controlled fury and helpless sympathy. They had believed in Elvis. They had bet their own careers on this strange, electrifying kid from Memphis. And now they were watching him crumble. "You're too different to be commercially viable," Denny said finally, delivering the killing blow with the casual cruelty of a man who believed he was simply stating facts. "Stick to truck driving. At least that's steady work." Elvis nodded once, a mechanical, involuntary movement, and turned away. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. His vision had narrowed to a single point of darkness directly ahead. The guitar in his hands suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. He walked, he didn't know where he was going, he just walked. The parking lot behind the Ryman Auditorium was empty except for their car, a beat-up vehicle that now seemed to mock their dreams of success. Elvis made it exactly 14 steps from the backstage door before his knees buckled. He caught himself on the hood of the car, his palms flat against the cold metal, his head hanging between his shoulders like a man who had just been told his entire family was dead. The sob that escaped his throat was ragged, ugly, the kind of sound that comes only from the complete and total shattering of hope. Scotty and Bill kept their distance, leaning against the back of the car, their cigarettes glowing orange in the darkness. They knew there was nothing they could say. Some pain is too big for words. Elvis cried for nearly 2 hours. He cried for the rifle he never got. He cried for his father's shame. He cried for every time the other kids had called him white trash, every time he'd shown up to school with holes in his shoes, every time he'd watched his mother work herself to exhaustion just to keep food on the table. He had believed, truly, desperately believed, that music was his way out. That the gift he felt burning inside him was real, was valuable, was something the world would eventually recognize and reward. And now he had his answer. The world didn't want him. The experts had spoken. He was too different, too strange, too much of everything and not enough of anything. His dreams, which had seemed so close he could touch them just hours ago, were now crumbling into dust and blowing away on the Nashville wind. The $3.98 guitar, the years of practice, the recordings at Sun, all of it was worthless. All of it was a joke that everyone but him seemed to understand. His fingers found the wooden neck of his guitar, still in the backseat where he'd left it. He thought about smashing it against the pavement. Thought about how satisfying it would feel to hear the strings snap and the body splinter into 1,000 pieces. But he couldn't do it. Because that guitar, whatever it had become, however it had evolved from that first cheap instrument, was still his. It was the only thing in his life that had never lied to him, never abandoned him, never told him he wasn't good enough. He pressed his forehead against the car window and let the last of his tears fall in shaky-legged silence. It was past midnight when Elvis finally spoke. "Take me home." His voice was hoarse, scraped raw from crying, but there was something else in it now, something that hadn't been there before. The drive back to Memphis was silent for the first 3 hours. Then, somewhere around Jackson, Tennessee, Elvis sat up straighter in the backseat. His jaw tightened. His red-rimmed eyes, which had been staring blankly at the passing darkness, suddenly focused with an intensity that made Scotty glance nervously in the rearview mirror. "He's wrong," Elvis said quietly. "That man doesn't know a damn thing about what I can do." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't empty defiance. It was conviction, the kind that comes only when you've hit absolute bottom and discovered, to your own surprise, that you can still stand. He arrived home at 4:17 a.m. and found his mother waiting for him in the kitchen, as he knew she would be. Gladys Presley had never slept well when her boy was out of the house, and tonight she had felt the weight of something heavy in the air, the way mothers sometimes do. Elvis sat at the kitchen table and told her everything. Every word Jim Denny had said, every moment of humiliation, every tear he'd shed in that parking lot. Gladys listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hands in hers. Her eyes, the same eyes she'd given him, were glistening with tears, but her voice was steady. "Baby," she said, "that man told you that you were too different, that you didn't fit into the boxes." Elvis nodded, his throat tight. Well, let me tell you something about boxes, Gladys continued. Boxes are for people who don't have the imagination to see beyond what already exists. That man couldn't see what you are because he's too limited to understand it. His boxes are his limitations, not yours. She squeezed his hands tighter. You remember why I made you get that guitar instead of that rifle? Because I saw something in you even then, a light, a fire. Something that was too big for East Tupelo, too big for Mississippi, maybe too big for this whole country. That man tonight, he saw the same thing. He just didn't know what to do with it, so he got scared and told you to go away. Elvis's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were different. These weren't tears of defeat. Strong people, Gladys said slowly, deliberately, turn pain into power. You take what that man said tonight and you use it. You let it burn inside you until it fuels everything you do. You make him eat every single word. Something shifted in Elvis's chest. The sorrow that had been consuming him began to transform, to harden, to become something else entirely. Barely controlled anger. And beneath that, unshakable conviction. He wasn't going back to truck driving. He wasn't going to disappear into the ranks of forgotten hopefuls who let one expert's opinion define their worth. He was going to become so undeniable that the whole world would have no choice but to pay attention. 13 months later, November 21st, 1955. Elvis Presley stood in the offices of RCA Records in New York City, having just signed a recording contract for an unprecedented $40,000, the largest deal in the history of recorded music at that time. Colonel Tom Parker stood beside him, but Elvis barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. It was on the Grand Ole Opry stage, on Jim Denny's dismissive voice, on a parking lot in Nashville where a 19-year-old kid had cried for 2 hours straight. Over the next 12 months, Elvis Presley would proceed to do what no one in the history of American entertainment had ever done. He released Heartbreak Hotel in January 1956. It sold 300,000 copies in its first 3 weeks and became his first #1 hit. He appeared on Stage Show, The Milton Berle Show, and The Steve Allen Show, causing controversies with his hip movements that only made people want to see more. Then came The Ed Sullivan Show. September 9, 1956. 60 million Americans tuned in to watch, roughly 82.6% of the television viewing audience. It was the largest audience in television history at that time. Critics who had dismissed him scrambled to explain the phenomenon. Teenagers screamed so loudly that you couldn't hear the music. Adults clutched their pearls and wrote angry letters to newspapers, and none of it mattered. Elvis Presley had arrived. And he was exactly as different as Jim Denny had said he was. That difference, it turned out, was precisely what made him unstoppable. The man who couldn't be categorized became the man who created his own category. The voice that didn't fit into boxes shattered every box that existed. The performer who was too strange for the Grand Ole Opry became the most famous entertainer on the planet. By the end of 1956, Elvis had generated over $22 million in revenue. He had 5 #1 hits, had starred in his first feature film, and had fundamentally altered the landscape of American popular culture. And Jim's Denny. In an interview years later, when confronted about his infamous rejection of Elvis Presley, Jim Denny had no choice but to admit the truth. I was wrong, he said simply. I was dead wrong. I was looking at something I'd never seen before and I didn't have the vision to understand it. I told that boy he should go back to truck driving and he went on to become the biggest thing in the history of show business. That's on me. I was too limited to see what was right in front of my face. It was a masterclass in humility, a public acknowledgement that sometimes the experts are the ones who understand the least. But Elvis characteristically never gloated, never sought revenge, never even publicly commented on Denny's rejection. Because by then he had moved beyond the need for validation from men who had once dismissed him. He had stepped down off other people's stages and built his own. He had taken the center of the room, every stage, every screen in America, and operated at the outer edge of his ability without effort. The scared kid from Tupelo had become the king. And the $3.98 guitar that started it all. It had been the key that unlocked a door no one else even knew existed. Here's what they don't tell you about legends. Legends don't start as legends. They start as scared 11-year-olds standing outside hardware stores with $4 and a dream. They start as teenagers with pomade-slicked hair and shaking hands, desperate for someone, anyone, to tell them they're good enough. They start as hopeful young people who dare to believe that the fire burning inside them might actually mean something. Elvis Presley's untold legacy isn't just the music. It isn't the 600 million records sold, the 33 films, the sold-out Vegas residencies, or the cultural revolution he single-handedly ignited. Those are just the results. The untold legacy is the moment he chose not to listen to the expert. The untold legacy is the parking lot where he cried for 2 hours and then got back in the car and went home to try again. The untold legacy is a mother who understood that being too different was never a flaw, it was a superpower waiting to be unleashed. The untold legacy is the $3.98 guitar that became more valuable than any rifle ever could have been. Because that guitar taught Elvis something that Jim Denny never understood, you don't need permission from gatekeepers to change the world. You don't need to fit into boxes that were built before you existed. You don't need experts to validate your vision before you're allowed to pursue it. You just need to keep going. You just need to turn pain into power. You just need to believe that rejection isn't failure. It's just someone else's inability to see what you see in yourself. When Elvis died in 1977, the world lost the king. But the lesson he left behind, the untold legacy that continues to inspire dreamers and underdogs everywhere, that never dies. It lives in every kid who picks up a guitar for the first time. It lives in every artist who gets told they're too different to succeed. It lives in every human being who refuses to let someone else's limitations define their potential. Gladys Presley was right all those years ago in that Memphis kitchen. Strong people turn pain into power. And her son, the poor kid from East Tupelo who paid $3.98 for his first guitar, turned more pain into more power than anyone before or since. The next time someone tells you that you don't fit into the boxes, remember Elvis Aaron Presley. Remember that the experts are often wrong. Remember that being too different might just be your greatest gift. And remember that legends aren't born, they're forged in the fire of rejection, tempered by the belief of those who love them, and revealed to the world only when they refuse to give up. That's the untold legacy. And it belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been told you weren't good enough? What did you do to prove them wrong? Share your story in the comments below, because every legend starts somewhere, and your story might just inspire the next one.